Hello and welcome to Lost Love Chronicles.
Dear listeners, before we get started, drop a quick hi in the comments and let us know where you're tuning in from. Also, if you have any suggestions for us to make the channel better, please let us know. Now let's start with the story. Adrian Turner knew that many of his fellow freshmen at the University of Illinois saw the college experience as something that happened outside the classroom. He thought those guys were arrogant. Some professors in his general education classes aimed to expose students to a broad range of knowledge. He found them pretentious, though he'd never say so to anyone. After all, these professors had PhDs and specialized deeply in narrow fields, while students were expected to cover a wider but shallower scope. You could learn from classes or from books. Books were cheaper, often easier, and quicker. The main purpose of attending class was to get certified to prove you knew the material. Some of what he'd learned from books, even he wasn't entirely sure he fully understood. Adrian wanted to become an electrical engineer, which required both specific knowledge and skills. Before anyone would hire him for that work, they had to believe he possessed both. So, he had to learn and pass the tests. He was confident he'd do well in his other courses too. Adrian viewed tests as a challenge. He planned to read all the assigned material, even if he wasn't about to change his mind that Coleridge couldn't match Kipling and Dickens couldn't compete with Heinlein. What Adrian really wanted to study had prerequisites, so he enrolled to complete those first. He picked up the textbooks and began reading while his roommates headed out to a party. To prepare for college life, he'd switched his Evanston bank account from savings to checking and withdrawn a couple $100s. The college bookstore accepted his personal check, leaving him with more cash than he needed, especially since his meals were covered by a dining plan. He mailed the bookstore receipt to his father, confident a reimbursement check would follow. His father was strict but fair. Adrian was expected to earn his money, but once he did, it was his to manage. Still, his dad would have been furious if he knew about the stack of 20s tucked under Adrian's shirts in his dorm bureau. They were within easy reach of his roommates, but neither his father nor his roommates knew. He felt ready for the first days of classes. This was college, and not all classes met every day. By the end of the week, though, he faced a surprise. He was struggling in calculus. Adrian rarely had trouble in any class except maybe gym, which he didn't count, and math had never been a problem. But the instructor gave a pop quiz on Friday, returned it Monday, and Adrian had earned a C, his first C on a math test that he could recall. His memory went back to grade school arithmetic, but it never included any CS. The grader, or teaching assistant, said, "If you have questions about the grading, see me after class." Adrian did. "This is my first C in math," he told the grader. "Let me see the paper." Adrian handed it over. "You earned it. Who was your teacher last year?" "Mr. Egan." "You wouldn't know him. Evanston Township High School. AP? And you never got a C?" "Only one B on a test that year." "Oh, low grade. Look, don't worry. Don't be too hard on yourself. AP Calculus is supposed to be first-year college calculus. It's meant to be the same as first-year calculus at University of Illinois, MIT, or even a community college, but those aren't exactly the same. I did my undergrad at University of Chicago. They put all the AP students in the same first-year calculus class, the real deal. This is how you actually do it. What that means is, you're a bit behind. Still, you got a C. Work really hard, but don't lose hope. You'll catch up." Adrian had last been behind in a math class when he'd been sick in bed for 3 weeks while the class was introduced to factoring. He'd caught up then, and he both felt stronger now and wasn't behind in anything else. He'd catch up. Though Adrian hadn't gone to college for the social life, he wasn't opposed to having a social life. All through his worrying about calculus, he'd kept remembering that Marlene Grant, the prettiest girl in Evanston, was now on the same campus. The last time he had asked her for a date, she'd said she was taken. That was hardly you. Never. On the other hand, she was being polite to a member of the MYF group she led. This year, he wasn't in any of her classes. He had never been in her class. Well, in the first place, Dad would laugh at him if he answered no for her. Let the other party make their own refusals, he always said. Every once in a while, they'll surprise you. In the second place, he had gone from being the new kid in the MYF to being, probably, the guy she knew best in Champaign. He was almost certain that the guy she had been dating hadn't come here. Then, too, Dad had claimed that an academic would have more prestige in college than they did in high school. He hadn't noticed that yet, but Marlene might share the opinion. While he dithered, his advantages, whether they were enough, were clearly getting smaller. He called the administration to locate Marlene. After another day and a half of dithering, he called the number they had given him. It rang, was answered. The girl who answered called for Marlene. "Marlene Grant speaking." "Marlene, this is Adrian Turner. I used to be in your MYF in Evanston. Nashville is playing in the Danielson Theater this week." He'd done his homework. Adrian always did his homework. I wondered if you'd want to go with me. Why, Adrian? Of course, I remember you. I'd be pleased. He found that her Tuesday through Thursday schedule was easier than her MWF schedule and suggested Wednesday night. She agreed, and he arranged to pick her up at her dorm. Judging by Marlene's reaction, it was an enjoyable movie. Adrian was too engrossed in his companion to follow it. He was sitting beside a girl in a movie theater. That sort of called for putting his arm around her, but he was fairly certain that this wasn't proper on a first date. The truth was that he was a fraction more frightened of Marlene than he was attracted to her. She went with him for a Sunday afterward, and that gave him a view of her in the light and the sound of her voice. They talked a little of their shared past and a lot of their new experience on campus. Marlene was planning on pledging a sorority. He figured that she was certain to get in, not as certain as she would be if the voters were boys, but there wasn't much doubt. He walked her back to her dorm. Now, a kiss at the end of a date, even a first date, was absolutely standard. When they got to the door, she looked like she expected one. He bent slowly, and she looked up instead of dodging. Their lips met. An electric shock surged through him. He held her shoulders to keep his hands from straying to sweeter, but forbidden, territory. When she moved back, he let her go and straightened. "Oh, Marlene," he said. He watched her in the door and then walked home, reliving the kiss. The difference between PE and gym was that you got to choose what you learned in PE. Adrian was bad at any team sport, so those were out. The school taught weightlifting, and he'd signed up for that. His classmates all looked like they'd been lifting weights for years. Still, he'd been at the bottom of gym classes for years, and this time he wouldn't be blamed for losing a game because he'd dropped the ball. He invited Marlene to another movie for the next Wednesday. The date went like the first one until they were walking to her dorm from the ice cream shop. She told him that rush week was about to start and that she might not be available then. Short term, this was bad news. Long term, her telling him meant that she considered that they were some sort of couple. When a girl accepted a movie date with you, it meant that you met some minimum standard of acceptability. Maybe she wanted to see the movie, and a goodnight kiss was a cheap price to pay for the ticket. Maybe girls like Marlene felt slighted if they went to a movie alone. Brittany had been overjoyed to go to a dance with him not because she wanted him, but because she wanted a date. Marlene could never be that desperate. No guy in his right mind would dump Marlene. Still, her steady was somewhere else, and Adrian was an acquaintance. It could be that simple. Maybe sororities had arrangements with fraternities, and she would accept dates from him until she and the freshmen who would be in that fraternity were sorted out. Telling him her schedule, however, seemed to signal some assumption that their dates would continue and some desire on her part that they would. At the dorm, he cupped her face while he kissed her. His palms, as well as his lips, felt as if they were burning. Back in his room, he wrote down Zeta. That, she had told him under a vow of strict secrecy, was her preference for sororities. "If I pledge another house, though, I'll be loyal to it. That will be the best house on campus and the best sorority in the world." He could believe, if not understand, that. He'd lived his life surrounded by fans of the Chicago Cubs, and they hadn't chosen their team on the basis of World Series performance. If the student register didn't keep track of her, he'd call any sorority that could be called Zeta. The Calc professor pulled another surprise quiz on Monday. When he got it back on Wednesday, it was still AC. Physics 101 required concurrent registration in Math 101. Since those guys were just meeting the derivative, the course wasn't getting much deeper than high school physics, yet. He took the first test in the course, and none of the questions gave him any problems. The 100 on the sheet he got back wasn't the good news it would have been later in the year, but it confirmed that his feelings during the test hadn't been delusions. Dad sent a check to cover his book bill. The only reasonable thing to do with the check was to deposit in a bank. He had always intended to have an account in Champaign, and he opened a savings account with that check. One of the guys in Calc class sometimes wore what looked like a fraternity jacket to class. Jerry looked like an okay guy, and he had to know more than Adrian did. Adrian approached him as class was letting out. He didn't have a class next hour, and he'd walk wherever Jerry would. "I'm Adrian," he said. "Jerry, you're in a fraternity, aren't you?" "Yeah." He sounded leery. "Do frats and sororities follow the same schedule?" "I'm dating a girl who's pledging, and I don't know when she'll be reachable on the phone or available for a date." "A pledge? Robbing the cradle. A little, aren't you?" "I knew her in high school." Then Adrian saw Jerry's issue. "I'm a freshman myself. Took AP Calc." Jerry thought a sorority woman would end up dating frat men. Still, he was willing to answer Adrian's questions. Sororities and fraternities were on the same sort of schedule. Have to be sometimes. He advised when Adrian's phone call would probably go through. He had to wait, and he spent a little of the waiting time preparing. He got a campus map, which showed the sororities and fraternities. They all seemed to be close together. Anyway, there was a theater closer to the sorority. He'd take her there. A coffee shop nearby served pie. Adrian called Sunday night. "Zeta Gamma Tau. May I speak to Marlene Grant, please?" This is Adrian Turner. Hello, Marlene. This is Adrian. How did you find my new number? I have my sources. Notably, I have the number of the campus student register. The question is getting repetitive, and I hope I'm not boring you. But would you like to go to a movie Wednesday? I don't know what pledges are allowed. Let me check. I can date, Marlene said when she came back on, but Wednesday night conflicts with a house activity. Well, how about Tuesday? Tuesday would be even better, getting to see her a day earlier. She repeated the question, got approval, and they agreed upon Tuesday. He checked the time, and Marlene was able to agree without consulting anyone else. It was a third date, after all. Then, too, the Oak Street Theater seemed to keep the air conditioning turned up one notch too high. He could put his arm around her and watch to see if she objected. It turned out that he had his arm on the seat back, and not the girl. Still, he had her warm shoulder in his hand throughout the entire movie. There's a coffee shop around the corner which serves pie, he said as they walked out. Thanks, but they feed us too well in Zeta. I'm afraid I'll end up too full, she said with a smile. Could you just walk me home? She didn't seem in a hurry, and she let him hold her hand as they strolled. When they reached her sorority house, she climbed the porch steps. Suddenly, they were eye level. Marlene, he said as she stood on the porch. She turned toward him, and he gently rested his hands on her shoulders. He leaned in for a soft, careful kiss. When their lips met, something unspoken passed between them, a quiet spark that made the world blur for a moment. When they finally parted, he whispered, "Oh, Marlene." Once she was inside, he took a breath and straightened his clothes, still feeling the intensity of the evening. The next morning, he sat in an English discussion section. They had just started the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. The TA brought up how the mariner stops a man on his way to a wedding feast to tell his story. Yeah, Adrian said, I call it the ear. Most poetry feels like it's written to whom it may concern, but some feels aimed at someone very specific. Like, you may talk of gin and beer while you're quartered safe out here. That's from Gunga Din. I guess most people reading it today weren't British soldiers stationed abroad. He pronounced Gunga Din with care, drawing out the vowels like foot and feet. Well, I'm going to keep us on Coleridge, but you ought to remember that for a paper sometime. If not in this course, in a more advanced one. Adrian wasn't sure that he'd take a more advanced literature course. He was still only dealing with distribution requirements as they came up. He had some sort of a steady date, with Marlene Grant, for Tuesday nights at the movies. He had to ask her for each one, but that meant that he had a perfect excuse to call her later in the week. Thursday night, he called her, and she agreed. Tuesday night, he called for her, walked to the theater with her hand in his, and sat through the film with his hand on her, as though he had every right. Afterward, he asked, "You still off desserts?" Let me nod into temptation. He took that to mean that she didn't want him to mention pies again. She took his hand and tugged him towards the route to the sorority. He followed, and they walked along holding hands but not talking. They were nearly to her sorority house, and he was already imagining a quiet, affectionate moment to end the evening when she suddenly stopped walking. He paused too, watching as she stepped off the sidewalk into a patch of trees, shaded and still. Without hesitation, he followed. He would follow her anywhere, especially into places where the world felt quieter and more their own. "Oh, Marlene," he said softly. He took her face gently in his hands and leaned in. Their kiss unspoken, but mutual. It was warm and full of feeling. Though she had declined dessert at dinner, there was something undeniably sweet in the moment they shared. When they finally pulled apart, he let out a breath and reached to gently smooth her back. She was light in his arms, familiar and close. He held her briefly, a gesture of closeness rather than passion, as they stood beneath the trees, wrapped in a silence that felt meaningful. "Oh, Adrian," she said. He kissed her again, more tenderly this time, and she responded with a quiet intensity. For a moment, they just held each other, not rushing anything. Then, almost with a shared understanding, they took a step back. "Maybe you better put me down now," she said gently. He helped her to her feet and kissed the top of her head, then guided them back to the sidewalk. Hand in hand, they walked the rest of the way to her porch. There, they shared one last soft kiss before she disappeared inside. On Thursday, he called and set up another date. Marlene seemed to enjoy the conversation as much as he did, if not equally. She certainly never questioned why he hadn't asked sooner. Friday brought a scheduled calculus test, this one lasting the full hour. He left the classroom unsure, a little downcast. Some problems had felt slippery, uncertain. When the grades were returned Monday, his test came back with a B. It looked like a low B, maybe even close to a C. He knew it could have gone worse. The selection of problems could have easily tipped the scale in the other direction. Still, he was improving. He resolved to prepare better for the next section. Tuesday came, and Marlene wasn't waiting when he arrived at her sorority. He knocked and asked the girl who answered the door, "Marlene Grant, please?" "The pledges aren't here," she said. They're out on a scavenger hunt. It was a surprise. Do you know where she might be? Well, she could be anywhere. That's kind of the point of a scavenger hunt. I don't think the pledge committee would be thrilled about anyone interfering, and Marlene definitely wouldn't appreciate upsetting them. Are you in a frat? She asked. No. Well, if you were, you'd already know all this. He already knew about scavenger hunts. Well, I understand why she couldn't be here. Not having anything else to say, he left. Not knowing when she would finish the task, he waited for the next evening to call. They had to let their pledges go to class, though he'd heard enough to know that pledges didn't always do required reading and homework. For that matter, some other students didn't either. So, he asked when she came to the phone, "Did you manage to bag a scavenger?" She chuckled. Then she said, "I'm sorry. I couldn't go with you." "I'm sorry, too, but I understand. Your sister explained that they sprang the scavenger hunt on you. She said it would be cheating if I helped." "Look," she said, "I wouldn't have been able to call you yesterday. They hardly gave us time to change our clothes. But, if I want to call you, what's your number?" He told her. Now, Marlene might initiate these calls. If she did, it would be bad news, but she would be calling him. "You didn't pledge?" was her next question. He wasn't about to tell her of his opinion of the frat system. "That's your thing. You didn't take calculus, either. Anyway, subject to some other surprise, could you come to a movie next Tuesday?" She did. Throughout the show, he cuddled her as much as he could cuddle such a small person sitting in such a large, hard seat. He didn't mention the pie, and neither did she. They walked towards her sorority hand in hand. When he got to the trees, he didn't lead her in, but he did stop. He looked her a question. This was her decision to make. She guided him gently into the quiet dimness. He lifted her again, holding her close, appreciating the warmth and comfort of her embrace. She wrapped her arms around him, and for a moment, he felt completely surrounded by her presence. They kissed, and the kiss deepened with mutual trust. When they paused, she looked into his eyes with a gaze that lingered, long and searching. He held her tightly and slowly set her back down. At the light suggestion of his hands, she turned. He leaned down to kiss the top of her head with tenderness. His hands moved with care, tracing her back in a way that left space for her to guide the moment. Her closeness had always felt reassuring, now even more so. "Oh, Marlene," he whispered. It didn't capture everything he felt, but it was all he could say. Somehow it seemed enough. She leaned back into his arms, resting there, and he held her quietly. The moment stretched a mix of comfort, affection, and unspoken connection. Eventually, he pulled away gently, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. He kissed her hair, her forehead, and then turned her to face him again. He lifted her once more for a final kiss full of everything they hadn't put into words. Back at the sorority house, though, that kiss turned out not to be their last. As she stood on the porch and he remained on the path below, their goodbye became something more an intense parting moment. She leaned in, their kiss deepened again, and for a moment, the world fell away. Then they both heard footsteps approaching. Instinctively, they stepped apart. Marlene went inside, and he turned to hide the emotion and physical tension still lingering from their closeness. The couple passed, heading into the house. He walked back toward the dorm, quiet and thoughtful. The last movie had required him to break the final $20 bill in his wallet. He pulled out the remaining $3 from his hidden stash and tallied up his spending. Everything added up. None of his roommates had touched his money. From that point on, though, he'd have to rely on his local bank account. His dad had warned him about unexpected expenses in college, and he had tried to be ready. What he hadn't expected was going on dates with Marlene, let alone the closeness they shared. It had been more meaningful than anything he'd spent his money on before, and he didn't regret a single cent. There had been several mixers, though the one his dorm had thrown was when he'd still been too scared to call Marlene. He'd heard, sometimes from Marlene, about frats holding dances. When the university finally announced an all-university dance, he called Marlene that night. She accepted. The dance was being held a decent distance away, and Adrian checked that Marlene was okay with the walk. She pointed out that she planned to dance most of the night. The walk will be the least of the exercise, she pointed out. From several sources in calc class, Adrian learned that most upperclassmen would be wearing suits or, at least, sports coats and ties. That sort of information was one advantage of taking a sophomore course that he hadn't imagined when he registered. He figured that his church suit would be fine. Maybe it wasn't. He got a few funny looks from the older sorority girls when he picked Marlene up. Marlene seemed happy, though. The others would be leaving a little later and going by car. The air was brisk, and it would be colder walking back. He must have paused when they passed the trees, because she commented, "We'll stop here on our way back," she said. "If we went in now, we'd never come out, and I want to dance tonight." And dance they did. Not every dance was slow, but there were more slow dances than he remembered from high school. After the first couple, Marlene welcomed other partners, even for the slow dances. She made it clear he could dance with others too, but he wasn't very interested. Dancing with Marlene now was a joy. Sometimes she moved close to him, and he admired the way she carried herself. Sometimes she was warm in his arms, and he felt comforted by her presence. Their last dance was a slow one, and they left the hall hand in hand. Outside, the air was cool enough that he offered her his suit coat. They laughed at how it fit. When they reached the trees, he playfully lifted her, leaning her against a trunk. He whispered something to her ear as he set her down. She smiled and gently held his hands. "You're so thoughtful," she said. Hidden from the street, they could hear groups of students spilling out and heading toward the sorority houses, their voices carrying in the night. But soon, her shivers seemed less from their playful moment and more from the chilly air. "Is it time to take you home?" he asked. "I'm afraid it is." When they got to the house, they could hear a party going on. Earlier, the noise had been drowned out by the sounds of other parties on the way there. "Would you like to come in?" she asked. "I'd love to." He enjoyed being with Marlene, not just the closeness, but simply sharing time together. Inside, the place was full of couples chatting and laughing. He noticed some of her sorority sisters acting more carefree than he expected. Though he appreciated being with Marlene, he wasn't comfortable with the attention around them. Marlene seemed to feel the same. She took his hand and led him to the stairs. "Are we going to your room?" he asked. "No. Let's say goodnight here," she said. She headed upstairs while he stayed on the ground floor, looking up as they shared a gentle kiss. Neither seemed eager to end the evening. He held her softly, savoring the moment. "Antisocial," someone muttered behind him. He broke the kiss, and they stepped aside. That seemed to signal the end of the night. He left before the older girl disappeared. Since they had skipped their planned movie night to attend the dance, he called Marlene the next evening to invite her to the movies the following Tuesday. She said yes, and he picked her up. The sky was overcast, and they both wore parkas. By the time they arrived, the sidewalks were wet, but the rain had stopped. The trees dripped quietly around them. As they walked back, he wondered if she would invite him inside and how many people would be there. Marlene started talking about the dance. Her tone wasn't very hopeful. "Didn't you enjoy it?" "More than I will later once. You see, the pledge chair sets up house dates. Our house goes to the dance with a frat house. Each girl goes with a pledge from that particular frat. When I wasn't available, Marguerite was delivering one fewer girl than she had promised, and one fewer guy had a date than the pledge chair of that frat had expected, maybe than he had promised. I told her that wouldn't happen again. Now, I'm not taking for granted that you will invite me to another dance, but if you do, I can't accept." And, of course, the girl not on offer had been Marlene. None of the girls was precisely ugly, but Marlene topped them all in beauty as they topped her in height. "I understand," he said. "You always say that. Do you really understand everything? Look, I want you. You decide how much of you can I have. I decide whether I want that much. Well, I do. I might want more, but more isn't on offer. Wouldn't it be childish to refuse what is available?" When they arrived at the sorority, she turned away on the porch instead of inviting him inside. Even if she had, he probably wouldn't have felt very welcome. The kiss she gave him, though, was gentle and kind. He could sense her presence, even if not everything about it. On later dates, she did invite him inside, but their favorite outdoor spots were often wet, too cold, or both. While they could spend time together inside, he sometimes felt confined. So they started meeting near the staircase. The actives were concerned about him going upstairs, so she would stand a few steps up and lean over the banister. He stayed by the stairs, not going up. This way, they could be close without crossing any lines. He thought about going alone to the university dances and hoping to get a dance with Marlene there. After all, she had danced with other guys when she was his date. But the one time he tried, it seemed the house rules kept her dancing or talking when resting with others from the fraternity. Eventually, she told him that her pledge activities would become more demanding, and she wouldn't have much time for him. Though he was disappointed, the quarter was ending, and he had plenty to focus on with his studies. He took what he thought of as Marlene time. He squeezed down some other study to have more time. He took that to go back and review everything that they had done in calculus. Current calculus assignments were part of the regular study time, but they got clearer as he went through the backlog of past reading, homework, quizzes, and tests. He started to get every homework problem right, and he got an A on his last test without straining. By the time he had caught up to the present in calculus, he was pushing a deadline for the last history paper. Then it was coming up on finals. He crammed for the first test, took it, crammed for the next, took it. When he'd taken the last test, his head was so full of details that he had to turn it off. He also hadn't shaved for a week and had only showered twice. He went from his last exam straight to a liquor store. After a late lunch, he went to his room and drank himself into a stupor. It was the only way he could turn off his head. He woke early the next morning with a vicious headache. He was glad to see, though, that he hadn't barfed. He took 2 aspirin, got to the shower stalls before anybody else was there. At the end of finals week, no great accomplishment. He took a hot shower. Experience told him that a cold one would only make the headache worse. He shampooed his hair. His hands didn't look steady enough for a razor. Back in his room, he took 2 more aspirin and dressed in clean clothes from the skin out. He was entitled to a full breakfast in the dining area, but his stomach allowed him only coffee. He got to the bank and down to the train station. He bought a ticket for a train to Chicago the next day. Back at the dorm, he changed the bed, stripped completely, and went back to sleep. When he woke again, he took 1 more aspirin and went down for a full lunch. He washed 2 loads of clothes and packed his bags that afternoon. He was tempted to call Marlene, but he didn't know her exam schedule. Even if she were done, her sorority probably had something going on. The other problem was a Christmas present. He didn't mind the cost. Everybody said it was the thought that mattered, and he didn't have the slightest idea. She had her own taste in reading, and he only knew that this was different from his. An article of clothing might be appropriate, but he had no taste in that area, and he was afraid that it might strike her sorority as too intimate or something. The next morning, he got to the station in plenty of time. Bob, a fellow physics student, came in a few minutes later. "How do you think you did?" Bob asked. "Well, you know how it goes. The ones you really focus on aren't the problem. It's the questions where the answer seems obvious right away, but you overlook something important that really trips you up." "So, you finished the exam?" "And went back to double-check most of the questions," Adrian admitted. "Curve breaker. I'd take that from the LibArts types, but you're supposed to actually think quantitatively. If Mankiewicz really graded on the curve, and I don't think he does, then a certain percentage would get an A, a certain percentage a B, and so on. The only way I'd affect your grade is by scoring better than you rather than worse than you. So, would you complain about a guy who didn't take a fall to have a worse grade than you did?" Bob took a long pause, and then nodded. "I didn't think of that." A lot more students showed up. He, not wanting conversation, went into another coach than Bob. Bob didn't look like he wanted to continue the conversation, either. The students filled up what had been a half-empty coach, and Adrian sat beside what looked like a farmer. He dozed halfway to Chicago and got off the train with his sleep debt much lower. The rest of the time, he made out his Christmas shopping list. "Evanston," he said to the cabbie. They had the suitcase in the trunk and him in the back seat before he completed the address. The cab's route was honest, and Adrian tipped accordingly. At the door, he gave the 2 very short rings that was the family announcement that somebody entitled to entry, but, perhaps, unexpected was entering. Then he used his key. "Adrian," Mrs. Bryant said. "Welcome home. Have you had lunch?" "Not really." She prepared a great lunch while he unpacked the stuff he'd use here and leave while he was in San Diego. Adrian knew that she also called Dad's office to tell him of Adrian's arrival. Mrs. Bryant had taken care of him for more than a decade, but her first loyalty was to Dad. So, Dad asked after their hug, "How do you think you did?" "Anything can go wrong." Dad nodded. "I think I did all right in physics. The calc exam felt good, but I was carrying a B average and not borderline either going into the exam. If grades come while I'm in Diego, you can open them." They had roast beef, Mrs. Bryant's best dinner, that night. Dad showed him the books he'd bought since Adrian went away. They both pretended that this wasn't a negative shopping list. These books Adrian wouldn't buy for his Christmas gift for Dad. They talked long, enjoying each other's company. "Remember Marlene Grant, the girl who ran MYF last year?" he finally asked. "Barely. Something of a vest pocket Venus, wasn't she?" "Still is. I've been dating her. 1 dance and some movies." "How many movies did you see in high school?" "Out of class?" Adrian asked. "They showed all those film strips." 3, I think." "And how many is the sum you took this girl, Marlene, to?" "I think 8. I started late, and she has this sorority which monopolizes her time." "Well," Dad said, "you were precocious about some things. If you had 8 dates with her in a quarter, the sorority wasn't really monopolizing her time. Just remember that you're behind your classmates in this area. Your emotions may be catching up with your gonads, but she's miles ahead of you in emotional maturity." "Why do you bring gonads into this?" Adrian asked. "I like Marlene. Did that rule out his gonads?" Well, he wasn't about to tell Dad about their making out. And that, as I said, is your emotions. After all, you'd seen her earlier. Did you like her in the same way then? Did you ask her to the movies? As a matter of fact, I did ask her for a date. She was going steady. Just my point, Dad said. You have dated 1 girl before her. She has gone steady with at least 1 guy. She's socially miles, or years, beyond you. Oh, I'll take it slow. I am taking it slow. What Dad didn't know just drove his point in deeper. His dates with Brittany had hardly been a romance. Marlene had these house dates all the time. She'd gone to a dance this quarter with more different boys than Adrian had danced with different girls his entire life. Sure, these were somebody else's idea, But that person's idea was to give Marlene a wide assortment of boys to develop a romance with. He'd started out as the only boy on campus that Marlene knew. Now, he was the one of the many boys she knew who least shared her world. Well, sufficient to the day is the evil thereof, which he quoted to the old man who'd quoted it to him often enough. Dad raised his eyebrows. That was the single response that Adrian could never answer. They sat in silence until Dad levered himself out of the chair. "Good night, son. Good night." Adrian grabbed the October issue of Analog, the first one he hadn't gotten around to reading. He took it up to his room, but fell asleep soon after. He finished the issue on his flight to San Diego, with the November edition packed in his suitcase for the return trip. His mom and both girls met him at the airport. April glanced at their mother and gave a small shake of her head. When she came in for a hug, he didn't lift her off the ground like he used to. Molly's hug felt more grown-up now, and her face seemed clearer, more mature. They had a good if slightly awkward time until Mom's current husband came home. "So, Andrew," the man asked during dinner, "did you make any new friends?" "I met a few people in class," Adrian replied, choosing not to mention Marlene or anything complicated to his mom. "That's what college is really about, you know. It's not what you know, it's who you know." Adrian was tempted to correct his grammar. The turd was using you when he meant I, and that was lucky for him, because he didn't know jack shit. Instead, he decided to deal with the claim. "So, if you suddenly need open heart surgery, should Mom select somebody who knows how to do surgery, or should she look for the guy with the largest circle of acquaintances?" "Hun, because, you see, you made a universal statement. If it is untrue in any one case, it is untrue as a universal. How about, the exception proves the rule?" That proved that the turd had actually followed his explanation despite the big words. That's a legal rule. If you say that killing someone is not to be punished if you prove self-defense, then that shows that it is to be punished unless you can prove self-defense. As he said it, Adrian realized that this was an inexact example. Smart Alec. Mom changed the subject to their schedule for Christmas. Molly had to go to a party. "You could come, Adrian. I'm sure that Muriel would be glad to have a college boy." "That's fine." What had Groucho Marx said about not wanting to be in a club that would admit him? Adrian didn't want to be at a party which was eager to have a college boy. They managed to avoid coming to blows, which should pass for a peaceful visit. Mr. Brewster sought Adrian out when he was reading alone. Adrian didn't take that for the start of a peace offensive, and he was right. "April's not really your father's daughter," the turd said. Adrian had thought about that since Molly had confided in him, and he had a reply ready. It was a variant of what Dad had said. "You and Mom sort of live out of one pot of money, don't you? I contribute more, but it's one pot, and part of what Mom puts in is Molly and April's support payments." A district attorney could prove all that easily. "Well, if April isn't Dad's kid, then taking that money is fraud. Are you calling your mother a fraud? And every time you tell a new person that April isn't Dad's, you provide a new witness that you were quite conscious of the fraud. It doesn't even have to be true." Adrian was talking out of his butt here. Law wasn't his field. On the other hand, he'd bet money on Brewster's ignorance of absolutely any field. As long as you believe that the money flowing indirectly into your pocket comes from a false claim, then you can go to prison for fraud. You wouldn't send your mom to jail. He didn't even pretend to believe that Adrian wouldn't enjoy seeing him behind bars. "I wouldn't know. But what if Dad figured that would be his only way to get custody of Molly? That wouldn't give him custody of April," the turd said. "Don't be too sure of that. Who would contest it? The guy, if Mom would even name him, who escaped support payments for more than a decade. April's old enough to have her opinion weighed, and she could point out that Molly is the relative with whom she is closest." The turd left with something more to worry about. Maybe that would keep his big trap shut. People think that others are like them, and Brewster would be happy to see an ex behind bars. Dad, of course, would be devastated, even if it came with custody of the girls. He was careful to fill up his camera roll with pictures of the girls. Molly gave him a couple of old shots. Just before leaving for the airport, he took his latest tie with him into the downstairs half bath. He took a dump, wiped himself with the tie, and left it in the wastebasket. Dad picked him up at O'Hare, and he gave him Molly's prints as soon as he'd unpacked. "These are from a while ago," Adrian said. "Who's the guy?" "Dunno. Ancient history, apparently. That's why she could spare them." "Is that the same guy?" Dad asked about the last picture. "Don't think so. See, she looks like she did for the summer visit." Indeed, she was wearing the top Dad had bought for her, and it no longer fit. Adrian didn't mention any changes in Molly's appearance to Dad. A brother wasn't supposed to notice. 2 guys in 6 months. Your sister moves fast. Adrian figured Molly had spent time with the guy in the 3 photos after school started, but had completely moved on by Christmas. That was quick. On the other hand, the longer a high school couple stayed together, the more serious things could get, and he didn't want Molly rushing into anything. None of this was something he wanted to share with Dad. Early high school years. Kids tend to change partners more often. Well, thanks for the photos. Your grades came. Dad handed him the envelope. And you didn't open it. Addressed to you. Dad said. That didn't keep him from staring at him while he opened the letter. No surprises. B in calc. He handed the sheet over. After all, if a third party was paying his tuition by scholarship, they'd insist on seeing his grades. They tell you that AP is first-year calc. Apparently, not quite. I think I caught up, but not fast enough. You know, I've been thinking. Come summer, I'll get a new car. Presumably, that wasn't what had required thought. Every 3 years, Dad traded in the last Buick for the next one. If you continue to pass PE and you get closer to an A than to a B in your academic work, then I'll give you the old car rather than trading it in. I'll even count credit hours, which are more for physics than the others. But I have to get at least 1A in a distribution course? I think I could do that. He didn't thank Dad. He would when he got the car. This, though, was less a gift than an attempt to influence him. On the other hand, the trees that sheltered Marlene and him were deciduous. They not only were cold right now, they were bare. A car provided a lot more privacy and, also, a path away from any possible eyes. Coming to church tomorrow? Dad asked. Adrian was conscious that most of the people he dealt with thought that he was slow to pick up social signals. This, though, was Dad's assurance that his answer didn't affect the offer. Well, he always did. Sure. I don't downstate, though. Christmas after? Sure. Pizza tonight? If their family had few members, it made up for it with family rituals for the two of them. The four of them had an entirely different set. If he didn't go to church this summer, he certainly would when the girls visited. At church, though, he saw Marlene. She was sitting further down and on the other side. People didn't scurry out of Aldersgate, though, when the service had ended. I want you to meet someone, he told Dad. Then he cut through the people in the back to where Marlene would be. Hi, Marlene said when she saw him. Long time no see. That sounded like an accusation. If it was, he deserved it. On the other hand, she had told him that she wasn't available, and she had his phone number to tell him when she was available again. On a third hand, she sounded like she thought that they were still friends. They were in church, though, and in front of her parents, obviously. She wouldn't want to fight in public. Yeah, you were busy, and then I was studying like mad, and then, I'll admit, I tied one on. Only way I can stop thinking after exams are over. That sounded defensive and terribly egotistical. It was all about Adrian. Did you make it through? Which sounded like he thought she would fail, or something. Yeah, I'm a real Zate now. Okay, she hadn't heard it that way. He'd mind his manners, and he might learn how she would describe him. Congratulations. Dad, this is Marlene, the prettiest girl on the U of I campus. Marlene, this is my father. They gave full names and shook. Didn't you teach him not to lie in church? Marlene asked. Well, I'm sure he hasn't taken a full survey. What is the number of your student body, anyhow? But an opinion based on an inadequate sample doesn't qualify as a lie. Dad answered, which told him what she had considered a lie. Marlene's mother called her, and she went without calling them back to meet him. You could interpret that in many ways maybe she thought he wasn't important, or maybe she just didn't want them to meet him at all. However, her greeting suggested they still had some kind of connection, and the fact she was fully involved meant the busy period that made her unavailable at the end of the quarter had passed. He said he'd call her when they got back to campus. Remember when you used to scoff at your dad for saying you might make new friends at ETHS? Dad asked as they drove. I didn't sneer. Well, you met Marlene there, didn't you? She's singular, and I met her in MYF. But Dad had a point, which you attended over my objections. Okay, Adrian admitted. The stop clock was right about something. Two things, Dad said. You might make an A in calculus next quarter, but you have problems with preschool counting. You made a new friend in Evanston, and going to MYF was a good idea. Adrian let him have the last word. Adrian found second quarter registration easy. The courses he had taken were year courses, even if he was taking X102 instead of X101, or Calculus 202. They met at the same time in the same place, and nobody, or at least few enough people wanted to insert themselves into those sections that they filled up before he got to register. He even took weightlifting at the same time. He called on Thursday to ask Marlene for another movie date the next Tuesday. She sounded pleased when she accepted. It was quite cold that day, however, and even colder in the evening when he picked her up. Marlene was bundled into a parka and only opened it when they were sitting in the theater. He took her hand in his, and she only removed it to take off her gloves. When he was walking her home, he nodded at the trees, bare of leaves, and looking frozen. No, he said. I'm afraid not. He couldn't blame her for skipping the porch kiss. It had already been a long night. Then she surprised him with a simple, come in, and just like that, the whole evening shifted. She took his coat and hung up her own. He noticed how striking she looked in a dress he hadn't seen before. Instead of heading upstairs, she led him into a room where several other couples were sitting close. lost in their own worlds. Marlene took a seat on a love seat, and he sat beside her. He leaned in and kissed her, gently tentative, sincere. She kissed him back, just as warmly. There was something effortless and genuine in that moment. He felt the connection between them deepen, more emotional than physical. He held her close, careful and respectful given the others in the room. They didn't speak much, but her presence, the shared closeness, spoke volumes. It was the kind of intimacy that didn't require anything more than being there, being present. Eventually, sensing the mood and the attention in the room, Marlene stood, giving him a chance to straighten up. She retrieved his coat, handed it to him with a smile, and got hers as well. Outside, the air was cold and crisp, but something in him felt lighter, warmer. It hadn't been about sparks or thrills, it had been about being seen, about quiet understanding. Later that week, he called her. He'd fallen into a bit of a routine with movie nights, but hadn't yet found a better plan. "I've got an idea," she said after he invited her. "There's a party dance Friday night. Instead of you inviting me, how about I invite you? Jeans, khakis, or suit?" He asked, then quickly added, "Wait, let me back up. Thank you. I'd love to. Now should I wear jeans, khakis, or a suit?" "Definitely a suit." 7:30. The party was packed, full of energy. But he managed to find her, and they danced. And it was real dancing, sharing movement, rhythm, laughter. There were 2 slow dances for every fast one, and the music never left much silence in between. But between them, something unspoken had started to grow. She introduced him to her roommates. That seemed to be a hint, and he asked each of them for a dance. The punch was strong, and he limited himself to 1 glass. With Marlene in his arms, he didn't need ethanol to intoxicate him. As the evening went on, some of the other guys and 1 or 2 girls seemed to be not taking those precautions. He wondered what a girl thought of inviting a guy to a dance only to have him decide that you were more tolerable through a haze. He and Marlene were waiting for the music to begin again, when a girl tapped Marlene's shoulder. "Can we see the 2 of you in the kitchen?" Marlene followed her, and he followed Marlene. There were 5 other girls in the kitchen, and he helped Marlene into the last chair available. "So," the one who had led them there asked, "Marlene seems to have chosen you. Who are you?" "I'm Adrian Turner. I'm a freshman like Marlene. I knew her last year in Evanston, and I was impressed then. She, however, was unavailable. I asked this fall, and she agreed to come on a date with me. We've been on several dates since." This didn't seem to satisfy her. "Let's see, I'll be an electrical engineering major." "Not yet. You know the rules, but I will be." Another of them asked, "How did you do last quarter?" "Not all that well," he confessed. "Adrian, be precise." Marlene sounded tense, but she'd asked him. "Well, I got a C in phys ed, an A in physics, and BS in English, American history, and calculus." Well, he took a breath. "Well, I took AP Calc in high school. It was enough to get me into second-year Calc, but it wasn't quite enough to prepare me for that course. I started badly, but I worked hard and got my grades up in the end." "How badly?" Marlene asked. Couldn't she wait until they were alone to go into his academic problems? He'd had some triumphs, too. "I got a C on my first test, a low C. You have to understand," Marlene said. It might have been the first C he'd ever received on a math test. Now, she sounded as though she were defending him. "I blew a couple of pop quizzes in high school, but it was damn well the first B I'd ever gotten as a final grade in math." "I remember," said yet another girl, "the first B I ever got in a math course." "You do?" asked the Grand Inquisitor. "It was also my last." "Well," he said, "I want to make that my last, too. This girl ought to at least tell them that you could recover from that sort of lapse." The honcho took charge again. "Well, you want better grades. Are you on a scholarship?" "Huh. Not unless you count my dad, like most of us." "And is he raising a ruckus?" "My dad would be thrilled with 3 BS and an A, but I've known parents to go off every deep end there is." She didn't understand Dad. Well, he wasn't sure that he did, and he had spent years with him. He said, "Nah. He did bribe me, though. If I pass phys ed and get more A's than BS for the year in academic subjects, he'll give me a car. He'll count by credit hours, and, since physics is a lab course, it has 4 credit hours. But that means I'll have to get an A in either English or history." "What does your father do, anyway?" asked the math whiz. "He's a VP, one of the vice presidents, of a small Chicago bank." "And what makes a bank small?" "It's not a small bank," Adrian said. "It's a small Chicago bank. Put it down in Champaign, and Albany might be the largest bank in town. It's just that Chicago has a couple of humongous banks that play on the national level. Albany isn't one of them. It's the Bank for Albany Park, a Chicago neighborhood, just like any small town has its own bank." And wouldn't Dad be surprised that he had listened to some of those mealtime ramblings? "Did you try to enter the Greek system?" the honcho asked. "Nope. And, as I've said, I had to put some serious time into studying this last quarter. If I had pledged, I wouldn't have had the time. Marlene showed me that. But that wasn't your reason? No, Adrian felt like he had to tread on eggshells. Really, I don't want to ruffle any feathers, especially Marlene's, and I know how important this is to her. Still, I don't go around asking, what made you decide not to major in electrical engineering? From your perspective, sororities are the natural choice, and, I suppose, fraternities for guys. For loads of us, we didn't choose not to pledge a fraternity any more than you decided not to major in electrical engineering. As I've said, I came to school to learn electrical engineering. They say I have to take various distribution courses, too. So be it. I'm not fighting. They don't say I have to join a fraternity, too. They don't say I have to join the Tiddlywink team, either. So I don't. Well, look, as I said, I don't ask why you didn't major in electrical engineering. People go to school for various purposes. It's just that I have my purposes, which are different from yours. I'm here to learn something particular. After all, going to college to learn something isn't an idea that would shock most of the people at this university. You seem to want to participate in student life when it comes to dating Marlene, another girl said. Well, I want to date Marlene. Sure, I was glad to come to your dance with her, but I was glad to go to the movies with her, too. I don't claim to be some studying machine. I take part in school life. I took part in high school life, too. It's just that I came to the university to learn electrical engineering. I'm here, and I live here, and I enjoy what's going on. When I was in Evanston, I took part in Evanston life, most, because I was in high school life, but not all. It's just, if you'll pardon me, that what attracts me about Greek life is one particular Greek, one particular Zeta Gamma Tau. That's nice, said the honcho. We'll send your particular Zeta out to you in a minute. He looked at Marlene and put his hand on her chair. She didn't object, though, and he left her in the lion's den. His glass of punch had disappeared. He wandered back into the dining room and asked one of the drink dispensers, "You have any straight ginger ale? You an alcoholic?" No, but he didn't want to become one. I've just reached my limit. She took one of the cups for serving punch, hauled a large bottle of ginger ale out from under the tablecloth beside her, and filled the cup with it. Marlene came back before 2 more dances were done. She didn't introduce him to anybody else, and they danced most dances. They sat 2 out 2 fast dances. For one of them, the stairs were crowded, and she sat 1 stair lower between his legs. For part of that period, he sort of hugged her with his knees. She relaxed against him when he did that. "It's breaking up," she said when some of the guys had gone out the door. He got his coat, and they had a long goodnight kiss. They weren't the only ones. He called her the next night to invite her to a movie again the next Tuesday. When he picked her up, it was chilly, but the wind wasn't blowing and the snow, which had been threatening all day, wasn't delivering yet. "Look," he said, "you know English, but you're still taking 102, aren't you?" "Yeah, Phillips. I've got Barnstable, but we've been going through the text fairly straight." As far as he could tell, a lit course could be taught odd chapters from high to low followed by even chapters from low to high. He supposed, though, that the professors owed it to each other to cover the same content in each quarter. It turned out that their 2 instructors had followed basically the text order, and they were in the same place. So he asked her what to do. "I've talked to my history professor. He suggested that I could have got an A if I'd put more effort into my paper." "Maybe so, but that quarter included the part of American history I really know about. I can't be sure enough about my history grade to omit trying for an A in English, too. You're the English expert. What should I do?" "Well, I'm not going to compare our grades, expert or not," she said, "but what got me through the pledge period with a B was that I'd read the literature stories early on. When I read them for assignments, I was dealing with familiar material. I can do that." Now, she asked, "What help can you give me on history?" He should have anticipated that question. The truth was that history wasn't among his strengths. He was just not so weak as he was in literature, as opposed to fiction. Not much. "If I'm going to write a better paper, I'm going to concentrate on an early period of what this quarter covers. I'm going to write about the guys who led us into the electrical era. Edison, Tesla, Steinmetz. Maybe I'll include Westinghouse, too. I don't know anything about him. That's playing off my strength, but it's not your strength." "Well, that's at least a suggestion," Marlene said. "Not the engineers, the strength. I know about writers. Maybe I'll cover some literary movement. Wasn't the Wild West invented during this period? I know it was after the Civil War." And that was just what she'd said not to do. Fiction was his strength, not hers. "Well, I'll work on some authors who interest me." Which showed that she was much more sensible than he was. During the movie, he sat with his arm around her, a familiar and comfortable habit they had developed. Since they were out of high school now, and she was a lady, their interaction was respectful and warm. The coats and chilly weather meant they didn't stop anywhere before reaching her sorority house, where she quickly ushered him inside. Several other couples were gathered in the front room, and he took a seat on the piano bench with Marlene close beside him. It wasn't much privacy, but it was all they had. Because of the cold, Marlene wore tights under her skirt. He could hold her hand and gently touch her arm. He also softly kissed her ears and the sides of her neck. The next night, Marlene called him. Her suggestion was even better news. Look, since we both have some of the same subjects, I had an idea. Why don't you come over Friday after dinner and bring your history and English books? Maybe we could study together. The sorority, which expected you to make out in public, had a private room for studying. He would have to leave, however, if any girl but Marlene wanted to study on a Friday night. He got the impression that an asteroid collision with the sorority house was a more likely danger. She knew what she was talking about in English, and he had already read the book in history. He was just as relieved when her sisters started coming home, filling the space with the kind of loud chatter that comes from people unaware of how noisy they are, calling out to someone right beside them as if they were across the street. They couldn't focus on studying anymore, and he was definitely done with studying for the day. On the bright side, it didn't seem like anyone else would need the study room for the next few hours. They shared a quick, affectionate moment before she stood on one of the chairs to reach a higher shelf. Then, after a few light-hearted exchanges, they headed out, and he got dressed for the weather. Tuesday started off gloomy, and by late afternoon, it felt like a storm was brewing. Just in case, he switched his study focus from Wednesday's classes to work ahead for the week in both English and history. An hour before his date with Marlene, the rain was still falling steadily. He gave her a call. "Have you looked outside?" he asked. "Yeah, you don't want to go out in that, and I don't want to take you out in that." "Well, no," she said. "It's gauche of me to invite myself over, but do you want a study date tonight and a movie some other time?" "Adrian, that would still mean you're walking all that way." Hell, to get 2 hours with her, even the studying without the after-study goodbye, he'd swim the distance. "Half as far, really," he pointed out. "I'd have to walk over and back anyway. I'd also walk with you. And, honestly, Marlene, I can move faster than you can." "Well, if you're willing." Telling him that the study room was in use, Marlene led him into what she called the dining room. It looked like one, too, although the last time he'd seen it, it had functioned as a bar. She had a conflict for Friday, which was apparently one reason she had accepted studying together that night. They were more balanced. She knew more of the history, and the English that they studied was verse. He knew verse, and fairly respectable literary verse. All he'd met before of their reading was The Highwayman, but much of it was a pleasure to read. Marlene enjoyed hearing him read it aloud. "I think that's it," Marlene said when the sounds from the entryway announced returning girls. "Yeah," he said. "I think we're done, anyway. I'll call, and we'll set up another time depending on your sorority's schedule and the weather." Nobody was coming in, though, and Marlene didn't suggest going out. When he lifted her, she put her legs around his waist. They kissed like that with him cuddling her, but, "Study? No way," one girl exclaimed. "Thanks, but I'd rather focus on her," another teased. "Really, Amy," Marlene said, "we did get a lot of studying done." "Yeah, I could tell. He'll probably ace anatomy. But did you study any of your courses?" The boy stood with Marlene between himself and the girl until the tension eased. Once he put on his coat and overshoes, the walk home through the cold rain helped clear his mind even more. The physics and calculus classes were starting to come into focus. There were students who were happy with a B, those who wouldn't settle for anything less than an A, and the rest. Not many students took both courses. Most calculus students were sophomores, while almost all the physics students were freshmen. And despite what Zeta might think, the University of Illinois produced a large number of engineers and science graduates each year. There were many discussion sections, and even multiple lectures for the basic courses. His studying with Marlene gave him more time with Marlene and would ultimately help his grades in the 2 distribution courses. They, however, added to his reading time. He needed to read ahead in the lit book so the writing was familiar when he got to it. Read the part he'd discuss with Marlene, read the part the next lecture would be on, and read the part the last lecture and discussion had been on. He'd brought a couple of analogs back with him from home, but he thought he was full up on fiction for a while. After a bit, though, the current reading came to be stuff he had pre-read. It might not cut out that reading, but it made it much easier. He and Marlene had a mostly steady date for Tuesdays. They decided whether to go to the show or study together depending on the weather and, sometimes, on whether they wanted to see the movie. When they didn't study on Tuesday, they sometimes found another time. As the weather became warmer and the trees started to bud out, they stopped at their trees when it was dry. Marlene wore pantyhose rather than tights and thinner dresses. He got much better feel of her, but he got the feeling, though she never expressed it, that they were being restricted by their lack of privacy. On the second all-university dance of the quarter, she suggested that he also dance with a few of her classmates from the house. He obliged, and they were nice to him. He and Marlene were going to sit out a dance when she led him toward a table already occupied. "Get 4 Cokes," Marlene said, "and join me at that table." When he did, Marlene introduced Natasha, her big sister, and Caitlin, Natasha's big sister, and thus Marlene's great big sister. Now, Caitlin, she asked, do you really want to hear Adrian's take on the real history of the Civil War? You can laugh at me, Caitlin said, but I'd be interested. Here's your chance. And, Natasha, let's move on. Believe me, you don't want to hear this. They took their glasses and moved to another table. He wasn't sure that he wanted to be Marlene's performing bear, and he wasn't happy about her assurances that Natasha had to be protected from his story. On the other hand, Caitlin had asked, and he had few takers for his interpretation. Okay, he began. 7 states seceded upon the election of Lincoln, and they formed a confederacy. After the firing on Sumter, the border states sorted themselves out. It was both political and military sorting, and I'll admit that there was military intervention in Maryland. Butler, Caitlin said. I'm a history major, after all. The last must have been an answer to his expression. Okay, then you know what came next. West Virginia was created by a political charade and enforced by military action. Missouri had governmental effort to secede thwarted by military action, mostly militia. Kentucky tried to stay neutral, which was called a farce even then. The Confederacy invaded, and they went with the Union. Still, the Union had to kick the Confederate troops out. When the sorting was over, he continued, 5 formerly slave states remained in the Union, 3 of them in the West. The next thing was the capture of the largest city in the Confederacy, New Orleans. After that, there were Union victories in western Tennessee. The Confederacy made a real play for Missouri and ended up losing a swath of Arkansas instead. By early '63, Grant was running around Mississippi trying to get at Vicksburg. The Confederacy claimed 13 states, 5 on the Atlantic, of which it controlled 4 and had control of major portions of the 5th. They claimed 8 states in the West. 2 of those were more or less happily in the Union. 4 more were contested with major Union forces controlling large chunks of space. Only Alabama and Texas were essentially under Confederate control. After you finish, Caitlin said, I want to come back to this. Fair. He knew he'd been sliding some Eastern victories. Meanwhile, the Union tried to take Richmond, was defeated, retreated, and regrouped, came back again. The Confederacy celebrated victories in the First Battle of Bull Run and the Second Battle of Bull Run. They don't seem to have noticed that they were in the same place, and the same place in Virginia. By the time the Union took Vicksburg, they had cut the Confederacy off from its westernmost section. By the time they finally took Richmond, there wasn't much Confederacy left for it to be capital of. Okay, Caitlin said, but that's a little exaggerated. A great deal of the combat in the Eastern Theater centered on the space between Washington and Richmond, and even more of the attention did. But almost all of the Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast of Florida was in Union hands before Vicksburg. The Anaconda Plan, he said. Yeah, everybody laughed at it, but the situation ended up mostly bringing it about. The North had tremendous manufacturing advantage, and that counted more at sea than on land. Then, too, and as an engineer you should appreciate this, sea travel was one hell of a lot cheaper than land travel. As long as Union forces were on the coast, they could be easily supplied. Anyway, your idea, if exaggerated, was well worth hearing. Let's find Marlene and tell her so. He didn't quite persuade me. Caitlin told Marlene when they had, but it sounded reasonable. He should put it in a paper. Did, he explained, bombed. Why? Marlene asked. I'd said it all in class, beforehand, and I had minimal citations to back up my assertions. Professor claimed I hadn't put in much research nor any thought on it this year. Which, after all, was true. And what does bombed mean? Marlene asked. A C on the paper. It was enough to get me a B in the course. Which meant, if all other things were equal, that a better paper might get him an A this quarter. Of course, all other things were never equal. You two go dance, Caitlin said. Adrian remembered the king of the asteroid in The Little Prince. Caitlin knew how to get her orders obeyed. Others were making out in their trees when they went past, and the front room was filled with cuddling couples. He and Marlene said, and kissed, their goodbyes standing up. Spring break was coming up. He'd see Marlene in church, but that didn't have to be the only place with a little forethought on his part. Going up to Evanston on spring break. He asked on their next call. Loads of kids went elsewhere. Yeah, me too. Taking your books? Think it's a good idea? She asked. Sure. You get a chance to get ahead of the lectures. Maybe we could study together. I'll look forward to it. He sent word to Dad that he would spend spring break at home. He found what train she was taking and told her that he would be on the same one. They were not, on the first day of spring break, the only students taking the train north. She arrived in a bevy of sisters and greeted classmates and other zats already there. She introduced him to scads of them, and he introduced her to 3 classmates whose names he could remember. They got a seat together. He noticed that she had a pass instead of a ticket. So how do you think classes are going? He asked her. They talked a little on study dates, but this was the time for evaluation and any mid-course corrections. Swimming is going fine. I'm going to use it come summer. Chorus is okay. She paused and totally changed topics. Look, how should I describe you? 6'1". EE major? Nerd? Basically, as long as I'm not there, say anything you want. But when you're there, this is my? She was asking what their relationship was. That was his question. What's accurate? He asked. Occasional date? Study partner? Distant admirer? You haven't been all that distant. Should I say that you're my boyfriend? I'd be very happy if that were true, he confessed. Well, we go on a lot of dates for not being boyfriend and girlfriend. Okay, and may I call you my girlfriend, too? After all, you go on other dates. I haven't dated anybody else since you went to the first movie with me. I'd say that you're the woman I'm obsessed with, except that you're an English major. You wouldn't want to be described by a sentence ending in a preposition. She laughed. They got on to lighter topics, and they even shared some times of companionable silence. When they got to the station, he helped Marlene with a bag until they got to her mother's car. Mom, Marlene said, this is Adrian. I've written you about him. Mrs. Grant, he said. They shook. He took a minute to let either of them offer him a ride. Then he took off for the bus stop. He took a bus and 2 L trains to Evanston. The L stop was less than a mile from home, and he walked it rather than wait for a bus. There were too many Grants in the Evanston phone book. He seemed to remember that the church had a members directory. Sunday, he asked Mrs. Danworth, the church secretary. Here you are, Adrian. It's a bit out of date, though. It had one Grant family, and they had a girl named Marlene. He copied down the address and number and gave the directory back to Mrs. Danworth. The rest of Sunday, he studied. He put equal time into physics, history, and English. He'd put enough time into calculus that he was ahead. Studying any subject would free his time for studying another later, and he used that to cut down his book load for trips. He didn't plan to share that wisdom with Marlene just yet. Monday morning, he called her up. Marlene, he said when she had come on. We spoke of studying together. Would this afternoon be a good time? I can get control of the dining room here. Or would you rather do it at your place? Or would another time be better? Your place would be fine. So, when would be a good time for me to come by and pick you up? He asked. How about 12:30? That was a little over 2 hours from when he'd made the phone call. Fine, he said. Your place, 12:30. He told Mrs. Bryant that he'd be studying with a friend in the dining room after lunch. She served him a welcome home feast for lunch, but she served it, as usual, in the kitchen. He left too early and got to her place before 12:30. He sauntered around the block once, but he was afraid that some nervous Nellie would call the cops if he did it again. He was still a little early when he rang the bell. Marlene's mom answered. Mrs. Grant? I'm Adrian Turner. We met at the train station. Marlene and I are going to be studying this afternoon. Marlene, Adrian's here. She stood aside to let him in the living room. Marlene came down the stairs carrying her books. He took them. Hello, he said. Nice to see you again, Mrs. Grant. Marlene let him out. When they were out of sight, he took her hand. I'm sure your mother is a wonderful person, he said, but, somehow, I feel uncomfortable talking to her. Just be glad you can escape. What's with the shirt? He looked down to see the UCLA sweatshirt he'd forgotten that he was wearing. Gift from my younger sister, April. I don't wear it on campus. He couldn't think of anything to say after that, and she didn't say anything, either. Just before they got to his house, she removed her hand from his. He opened the door and ushered her in. Mrs. Bryant met them. Mrs. Bryant, this is Marlene Grant. We're going to be studying in the dining room. Miss Grant, Mrs. Bryant said. Introductions over. He led Marlene to the dining room and closed the door. He led her around the table and seated her. Then he went back to where he had already set his books up across from her. Marlene sat with her feet under the chair. Not even their feet were going to touch. Clearly, she hadn't prepared for this session. On the other hand, in the English book, the authors, and sometimes the actual selections, were old friends. He'd barely heard the names, and sometimes not even those. My brain went numb 10 minutes ago. I don't know anything, she said after a while. Okay, come here. He had arranged for her to sit with her back to the window. Even if someone was in the yard, they probably couldn't see inside, especially this far in and during the daytime. She sat close to him while he gently rubbed her shoulders and neck. He held her hands, and she didn't pull away or object. Mrs. Bryant cleared her throat from the doorway. Would you please shut the door? He asked. I thought I had shut it. He knew he had. This was his space for now, and he'd agreed on it with her beforehand. Is Miss Grant staying for dinner? Good question, he admitted. Can you? I couldn't possibly, Marlene said. Alas, no, he said. It was 5:45, meaning his use of the dining room had expired 15 minutes ago. Mrs. Bryant was right once again. He helped Marlene up and stood her on her feet. He grabbed the books and walked her toward the door. She has to set the table, and I have to walk you home. What did she see? Marlene asked. Very little. My back was to that door, and I'm wider than you are. What did she guess? Probably a fair amount. She's a married woman with kids. Hell, a grandkid. I doubt that there is anything she hasn't done. What will she tell? Absolutely nothing to Dad. What she gossips at home about the doings of the Turners, I have no idea. She's probably not used to providing much gossip. We're an incredibly dull family. I don't think you're all that dull. That's nice to hear. I'm not certain that your sisters share that opinion, though, he said. Well, shall we do this again? Does Wednesday suit? Want to start with lunch? She might clear her throat like some artillery barrage, but Mrs. Bryant is a good cook. Is she there Wednesday too? Every day? She worked part-time before the divorce, but Dad hired her full-time afterward. Sounds good, she said. Wednesday then? Yeah, thanks. She took his hand and didn't let go until they were near her house. Thinking she'd prefer it, he stopped at her walkway and watched her go inside. They weren't at the stage of holding hands openly in front of her mom, and they definitely weren't at the point of being overly familiar in front of Mrs. Bryant. Despite what he'd told Marlene, Mrs. Bryant might say something about her being there. He should tell Dad, and at dinner he did. Marlene came over, and we studied. I invited her back for lunch on Wednesday. Told Mrs. Bryant. I invited her too late. I'll tell her tomorrow. That's not the only thing that's late, Dad said. Well, new rules. Miss Grant, and any other friend of yours, is perfectly welcome on this floor. Meaning that I shouldn't take her up to my room? We aren't anywhere near that stage in our relationship. Listen to yourself. Dad thought he wanted the relationship to get to that stage. Well, that was no great secret. I should have asked more for the car. It appears that you're more motivated than I thought to get the privacy that a car provides teenagers. You couldn't have asked for much more. You're already asking for 1A. Dad held up 3 fingers to remind him that the formal rules included calc and physics. I couldn't possibly get more than 2. If I do, it'll be because I'm studying with Marlene. I never asked for credit. That wasn't part of the deal. Reminded, he told Mrs. Bryant about the invitation when she came in the next morning. Certainly, Adrian. Could you let me clear the table and take care of the tablecloth before you put out your books? So, lunch with Marlene would be in the dining room with a tablecloth after all. He ate lunch in the kitchen with Mrs. Bryant, and even Dad didn't get a tablecloth when just the 2 of them ate dinner. Lunch was delightful. When Mrs. Bryant took the tablecloth away, she left a kitchen timer. They really learned a lot. The timer went off at 5:30. Marlene got up and stopped the ringing. Her blouse was neat, and they both felt ready as they walked out the door. He was well prepared, and he believed Marlene was too, as they took the train back to campus. Since it was Sunday, Dad drove him. Adrian had invited Marlene along, but she preferred not to raise the subject with her parents. They were now study partners, and much of their conversation on the train was about Marlene's plans for her history paper. They also shared comfortable silences. Movie Tuesday? He asked as he set her suitcase down on the sorority house porch. Weather permitting, of course. Why? Thanks, she replied. They smiled and said goodbye. That night, Adrian read his calculus and physics books for the upcoming lectures, his thoughts drifting to the time he'd spent with Marlene at the end of their study sessions. The next day, though, he started to worry that he might have overlooked something important. Marlene had called herself his girlfriend, but he'd been focused on their study plans. Adrian knew he wasn't good with subtle hints. That's why he excelled in physics, but needed Marlene's help with English literature. After they left the theater and walked to their usual spot by the trees, he asked her directly, "Are you really my girlfriend?" "Of course," she said, walking ahead into the trees. "Marlene, you are sweet." When he lifted her, she helped by wrapping her legs around his waist to steady herself. He kissed her gently and caressed her arm. So sweet. When she was back on the ground, she leaned into him, and he wrapped his arms around her warmly. At the end, he lifted her from behind for one last series of affectionate kisses on her cheek. "So sweet," he repeated. After that, there was no need for a kiss at her door, but he couldn't resist, and she didn't either. On Friday, they had a study date. They were as far ahead as they wanted to be in their books, and he suggested they review what they'd see next week. When they'd finished both subjects, he pulled his chair back until it blocked the door. He lifted her until she stood in the doorway. He hugged her close, holding her steady. She got down, and they moved the chair back before anyone could come in. Tuesday night, he lifted her from behind. She placed her feet against a tree trunk, and he leaned into her, so she felt supported. That left his hands free to hold her hands gently, and he kissed her hand softly. "Adrian," she said. He had promised himself he'd always stop when she asked. He stopped now, holding her as she slowly settled down against him. It seemed like they couldn't go much further without more privacy. Dad said he'd given the car if he got an A in either English or history. Right now, it felt like he'd get both, but there were lots of ifs. The only other way to get privacy was to live in town. That looked expensive. A private bathroom sounded like an improvement, but that meant he'd have to clean it, and, for his sake, clean it according to Marlene's standards. If he couldn't get more, Marlene kept giving him as much. Her sisters began to accept him, too. Every time another Zeta's guy dumped her, cheated on her, or got drunk at a Zeta event, his stock went a little higher. He seemed to be doing well enough in history so that he could still get an A for the quarter with a decent enough final, an AB on the main paper. He decided to go with what he'd suggested to Marlene: the electrification of American industry. He got and read a biography of Westinghouse. He got biographies of the others, too, but he planned to use them merely for citations. In English, on the other hand, his grades this far averaged somewhere midway between an A and AB. He needed an A on the paper. He decided to go for broke. Besides, Barnstable had already said of the paper, "I know how much you've read the text. It's in my grade book. Show me that you've read an author, or, at least, a work, not in the text." That sounded like Adrian could get away with a paper on the growth in Heinlein's heroines as his writing matured. He wasn't going to get that risky. After all, a C in the course would blow his chances for any privacy the next year. He did expand on the comment he made in class about authors addressing a particular audience. His first draft started. The attributed ear in verse. While most literature is addressed to whom it may concern, authors sometimes address a particular audience, either actually intending them or as a device to set their piece in a particular context. In prose, we have the epistolary novel. All lines except the asides in a drama are, of course, addressed to particular characters. Verse has nothing so well defined, but there are examples. Marvel openly addresses his coy mistress. Coleridge has an opening third-person description of the Ancient Mariner stopping 1 and 3 as a setting for his first-person narrative. Some examples simply assume a context. "You may talk of gin and beer while you're quartered safe out here," begins Gunga Din. "Get you the sons your fathers got, and God will save the queen," ends one of Houseman's poems. The Ancient Mariner was in the text. Marvel and Houseman were, but they were represented by other works. Kipling was totally absent. Once he'd mentioned Houseman, Adrian went on. Worthy of special consideration are Houseman's dialogue poems. Underscore 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 consists of a challenge to Terence and his response. Underscore 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 has each quatrain as a dialogue. The dead friend asks questions in 2 lines, and the living one answers in the next 2 lines. He'd have to flesh it out, and he'd have to look up the poems. In the edition of A Shropshire Lad he'd read, the poems didn't have titles, merely Roman numerals, and he'd be damned if he could remember them. On the other hand, finding most of the poems would be easy. Dr. Fell might be harder. He couldn't remember who wrote it. He worked on the papers. He studied for classes and earlier for study dates with Marlene. He attended every PE class. He laundered his clothes on a regular schedule. Even so, he didn't feel overworked. Before study week, he had 2 study dates with Marlene instead of going to a movie. They kissed goodbye and agreed that they wouldn't meet until exams were over. He got his exam schedule and set up his study schedule. When he walked out of one exam, he ate and began cramming for the next. When he got out of physics, his last exam, he headed for the liquor store. High proof, low price was his criterion. He changed into pajamas and tied one on. He woke to someone pounding on his door. "Phone for you." Kurt, one of his roommates, shouted. "Says it's a girl." He got up, pulled on his robe, and went out the door to the hall. The phone was hanging on its cord. He desperately needed to piss. "Hello," he said. "Adrian?" It was Marlene, and exams were over. "Marlene? I'm sorry. I'm fuzzy-headed. Something happened?" she asked. "Tied one on. Always do after exams." "Sounds like this is a bad time to call." "Really," he said, "it is. If he didn't get to the Johns soon, he'd piss on the floor. Call me when it's a better time, will you?" She hung up, he hung up, and he made it to the John on time. When he woke again later, he decided that better time included his being bathed, shaved, dressed, and fed. He accomplished the shaved part after breakfast the next morning. It was the last step. He called it what he considered a decent hour to call a bunch of college students right after exams, a little after 10. Some of them might be still taking tests, but those would be up, maybe in the tests, by then. They arranged to meet at the station and ride up to Chicago together. Shortly after he got to the station, Marlene rode up in a car with some of her sisters. Others showed up, mostly in other cars. Apparently, sorority sisterhood included, for freshmen, a ride to the station from someone in the sorority with a car. On closer inspection, it looked like the upper-class woman had a boyfriend with a car. That made at least 1A for the year more important. On the train, he sat with Marlene. Facing them were 2 of her fellow Zats. Behind those were 4 more. They talked among themselves. He knew that he had no gift for small talk, and from what he heard about grades, they wouldn't sympathize with his worries over whether he got his 3rd A. He listened and watched Marlene. "So, Adrian," a girl he'd met several times asked, "aren't you afraid of being surrounded by Zats?" She clearly had the gift of remembering names. "Not at all. I understand that National has signed the Geneva Convention, but that's only if you're captured. Don't look now, he said, but one of your number captured me long ago. So, another girl asked, why don't we see a ring? Well, she's hooked me, but she hasn't decided to put me in the creel yet. She's thinking of throwing me back. I don't know, Marlene said. I think he looks like a keeper. That was very nice to hear. And now we know what kind of fish I am, he said, though I didn't know she was English. I'm a kipper. That got him groans, including one from Marlene. Apparently, they had exhausted that topic of conversation. They went back to exams and how the house files had failed one girl in particular. Really, what did she expect? But he kept his ears open and his mouth closed. Dad's advice was much more useful in describing behavior than in modifying it. You guys look like you're having fun, a girl said from the aisle. I'm all alone. Can I squeeze in? Apparently, from the welcome she got, she was another Zate. Marlene pressed against his side, and he scooted over. Then he pulled her close against his side. Generous of Marlene how much room she's giving Trish, isn't it? One girl asked. She moved away from her. I don't think Marlene likes Trish. That came from behind the seat facing them. Everybody was participating. She might just like Adrian more, the girl they were making room for said. That was Trish, for a ride with Marlene pressed against his leg. He should remember her name. You think? Asked the chorus. Just giving you a little space, he said. If she really liked me, she'd sit closer. Marlene stood up and moved toward him. He helped her settle beside him. Sure, she was just being friendly to impress her sisters, but he was glad she was showing some warmth toward him instead of indifference. Whatever the reason, Marlene stayed close to him for the rest of the trip. He couldn't fully relax with the whole sorority watching, but he could sense her presence nearby. When a conductor came by to collect tickets, Trish went back to get hers. It was a brief pause, and Marlene stayed put. When they got to the station, he got off first. He swung her bags down. Marlene was halfway down before he got her bags to the ground, so he merely gave her a hand instead of swinging her down, too. He helped the rest of the Zats get their luggage down. Then he picked up one of Marlene's bags and both of his, and started inside. Dad met them when they were still by the tracks. He saw what was happening and took Adrian's bags so he could carry both of Marlene's. And can we drop you at home, Miss Grant? Dad asked. I think I'm being met. When they got into the building proper, she was. Her parents, and what was apparently her brother, greeted her. Marlene made introductions. They went to her family car. He trailed Marlene, and Dad trailed him. When he had Marlene's luggage in the car trunk, Dad handed him the heavier of his 2 suitcases. He led to the car. Not both families are equally happy with the romance, Dad said. You could tell? For that matter, Dad had never before said that he was happy with his relationship with Marlene. Romance might be too strong a term, though he thought it a hopeful one. You get the app into the hardware store? Dad changed the subject. Yeah, thanks for picking it up, by the way. Mr. Schmidt sent an acceptance, but it doesn't start yet. U of I starts its vacations before normal people do. You're welcome. He thinks you're a good employee. They picked up the pizza on the way home. Adrian Turner was barely back in Evanston from the University of Illinois when he decided that Dad was running his life too much. It was time for him to declare his independence, and church was a good occasion to do so. You know, he said on their way to church. I didn't attend in Champaign. I know. You told me once. Dad was probably trying to evade the question. Well, I didn't. Don't you think attending up here reeks of hypocrisy? It's not Adrian attending. It's Jim Turner dragging his son along with him. That's an awfully harsh way of expressing it. I haven't dragged you since you were 8. Do you remember me picking you up, carrying you into Sunday school, and setting you in a chair? He did, and it made him blush even yet. Well, I'm not 8 anymore. My point exactly. Now, obviously, you've decided to come today. And, after all, this church is a good deal of your connection to the community. By now, they'd parked, but Dad made no move to get out of the car. You're still going to work for Mr. Schmidt, and you met him here. The work isn't my idea. And didn't you meet Marlene at MYF? That was a point for Dad. Rebelling was all very well, but what if Marlene expected to see him in church? She did see him, and he saw her, but they didn't speak. Was that worth getting up in the morning and putting on a suit? Actually, it was, but there were better ways of seeing her. When he got his job schedule Monday, he had Saturday off this week. As a summer worker at the hardware store, he replaced guys on vacation, which meant he worked whatever hours the guy he was replacing had. Tuesday, he called up Marlene, and they set a date for Saturday night. He worried that Dad would insist on church attendance as a condition of borrowing the car, but he didn't. He got to Marlene's house a little early. Is Marlene here? He asked. Silly question, but he had to say something. One more minute. That was Marlene calling from some other part of the house. Come in, said a man who had to be Marlene's father. I think we should set some ground rules. He'd been through this before. It felt a little unnecessary for a girl who'd spent most of last year at the U of I campus a couple 100 miles south. Still, he was willing to answer the questions. It was easier than enduring the tough, questioning Marlene's sorority sisters had put him through. You want ground rules? I'll give you some. Marlene called down from upstairs. 1. I am an adult. 2. I choose my own friends. Even though she was right there, she was still shouting. 3. I set my own rules. 4. I decide my own schedule. 5. Stay out of it. Come on, Adrian, she said, sweeping past him and heading out the door. He caught up before she reached the car. His legs were a lot longer. When she settled into the passenger seat, he walked around and got in. He started driving toward the movie. He understood intellectually that she wasn't truly upset with him, but an angry Marlene was still a concern. At her request, he pulled over so she could quickly fix her makeup. You know, your father loves you, he began. It worries me to see you so mad at somebody who loves you. Well, that happened to me. Well, if you still love me 15 years from now, love that, Marlene. He treats me like I was 5. She was exaggerating. 16, maybe. Look, I've got Kleenex in the back. Want some? Sockeye. I've got some here. And, when she'd used it, he adjusted the mirror back where he needed it and turned off the dome light. He drove to the theater. When he first put his arm around her shoulder, it was so tense he was afraid she'd shake him off. Slowly, though, as she got involved in the movie, she relaxed. Afterwards, he was tempted to suggest the back seat. Her time with him was a declaration of independence from her father. How independent did she want to be? Still, he was cautious about pushing her. She'd said no before, and in her current mood, she might be even more inclined to say no. He cared for her deeply, on whatever terms she was comfortable with, and he feared that pushing too far would close any chance they had. Still, sitting side by side in the front seat and fully dressed, she responded warmly to his kiss. Marlene, he said softly. She was special, and her reactions were meaningful to him. When he kissed her gently on the face, she drew him back into a tender embrace. Finally, worried she might insist on going home if he didn't, he pulled back to drive her back. He reversed into the driveway to get her closer to the door. She waited patiently for him to come around, help her out, and walk her to the porch. Standing close on a step that brought their faces level, he shared one last kiss with her. Though less intense than the private moments they'd shared, it was just as sweet. He waited until he was shielded by the open car door before adjusting his clothes. Even though the tank was more than half full, he bought gas on his way back. Dad would have enough to complain about, and he wasn't going to provide him any more. Marlene's argument with her family was a continuing worry. He was on her side. Would have been even if he hadn't been the subject of the fight. But he'd been in enough fights with Dad to know that Marlene's fight would end sometime. And he didn't want to be what she gave up in the compromise. Well, he had been perfectly willing to answer Mr. Grant's questions tonight. Maybe he could answer them tomorrow in a way that didn't offend Marlene. Dad made no comment that he was ready for church after having said that he wouldn't go. They sat together, and Marlene, whatever her arguments the previous night, sat with her parents. He and Dad got through the line before the Grants, and he stayed behind to see them. Dad walked down the steps, but waited on the sidewalk. Mr. Grant, I'm Adrian Turner, he said when Marlene and her parents had gone through the line. Mr. Grant sort of acknowledged that he knew who he was. There were really 2 questions, he began. He'd planned this out so he stayed on Marlene's side while satisfying her father. Is Marlene an adult capable of judging her associates and free to decide upon her friends? And am I a serial killer stalking your daughter for my next victim? Well, the first question being decided in the affirmative, I don't at all mind setting your mind at ease with respect to the second. After all, I'm only one of several men Marlene dated at U of I. I'm likely to be the only one of them you'll ever meet. Well, Mr. Grant asked, then who are you? I'm Adrian Turner, a member of this church. Once upon a time, I was a member of the MYF chapter that Marlene led. I'm an electrical engineering student at the U of I. What more do you want to know? What fraternity do you belong to? I don't belong to any. I live in a dorm and never tried to pledge. Don't you think, Marlene's father asked, you're missing out on part of college life? What in hell did that have to do with his respectability as a date for Marlene? Even the sorority girls hadn't pushed that hard, and they were, after all, the people who had just made that decision. Well, what I want out of college is to be trained for the career I've chosen. I don't see how being paddled will prepare me for that career. He was working to keep it light, but it was work. Do you think that becoming an engineer is really being educated? Now her dad was on another attack. It was, however, an argument he'd had before. A college education, most certainly. That is the advantage of passing a college course. You know that you've absorbed all that the powers that be consider part of that section of knowledge. When you read a book, though, you might have learned a great deal, but you never knew that you'd learned the required details. But that section of knowledge isn't something that everybody has to know. That's certainly true. It is, however, something that somebody has to know. We don't all have to know brain surgery, but it's damn convenient to have some brain surgeons around. Now take history, he continued. That was a particular which he'd thought out before. I passed the general American history course. I could take another course in the history of the Civil War. But if I did that, I'd have to learn all about the war in the East. I happened to be interested in the war in the West. It was mostly east of the Mississippi, but contemporaries considered anything west of the Alleghenies as West. He was riding his hobby horse. Now, it wasn't what he needed to say to this man this day. Anyway, I can read books to learn lots and lots about what interests me. Since I don't want to teach history, I don't need to learn the other stuff. Marlene is different. She can't go into the classroom and tell her students, "Short stories bore me. We're only going to study poetry." But if somebody just wants to read, he can read only poetry, or only novels, or only detective stories. Well, that man isn't educated, reading only detective stories. Since he'd mentioned his own interest in Civil War history and not his interest in SF, this was quite beside the point. Well, if he wanted that, he could swallow another example which might not be so satisfactory to him. And is a man in the 20th century really educated who doesn't know the theory of special relativity? Come on, Adrian, Marlene said suddenly. She grabbed his arm and pulled him down the stairs. "You're walking me home." More accurately, she was hauling him away, but he was willing to go where this woman wanted him to go. "Walk briskly and don't talk," she whispered. "Okay," she said a little later, "you can slow down a little." "Well," he told her, "you know how I feel." And starting on fraternities before going on to the purity of a liberal education. Either was an argument, if a faulty one. Both together sounded silly. "He was trying to find something wrong with you," she said. "If you'd been a member of some rival frat, he'd have dug into you for that." Really, Mom always talks about her sorority life. Dad doesn't harp on his frat background when he isn't pawing the ground. "I tried to be friendly." "And so you did." She took his hand in hers. He looked at the street. On the square grid, there were a dozen ways to walk from the church to her house. He noticed that they weren't on any of them. They had, in fact, walked north while her house was south. At the next corner, they turned west, which with some blocks going south would get her home. Well, he enjoyed walking with her. He didn't care if they weren't taking the most direct route. Meandering or not, their route finally got to her front porch. While she was standing on it, he stopped with their heads level. Even if this hadn't been a date, maybe he could get a goodbye kiss. "No," she whispered. "Come up here and lift me high." When he did, she wrapped her arms around his neck and held tightly, while her legs rested against his waist. Her dress rode up a bit in this position, but he didn't pay attention to that. Instead, she immediately leaned in and gave him a long, heartfelt kiss. "I love you," she said softly, surprising him by saying it first. His suit jacket concealed his reaction, something he hadn't really noticed before. "I love you too, but I don't fully understand you," he admitted. He sensed that the intensity of their kiss wasn't just about affection between them, it was also her way of asserting her independence from her family. Later, when he got home, his dad said, "I didn't know when you'd be back. I ordered pizza." They usually went out to eat after church, but pizza was fine with him. Dad was already in a plaid shirt and went upstairs to change. He came back down wearing his white undershirt, his usual church day attire. They sat across from each other in the kitchen and ate, using their hands since pizza didn't require silverware. "You're the logician of the family," Dad said when he'd finished. Adrian was still nibbling his last piece. "Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'd think that walking your girl home from church requires attending church." He thought about that for an instant. "Easter parade," he said. That should remind Dad of one of his bêtes noirs. The people in the New York Easter parade had once worn their finery to church and then paraded after service. These days, they merely rendezvoused at the church and paraded without attending any service on the most holy day of the Christian year. Point. Will that particular girl accept that? Which was a point to Dad. But, really, there was no reason to believe that Marlene would welcome his walking her home, even if he attended services. She had a ride, after all, in her family car. And she always wore heels, which couldn't make walking fun. "Maybe not, but I don't think I'll attend or try to walk her home. When your sisters are here." Okay, when the girls were here, they'd do what they could together, and sitting together in church was certainly one of those things. How about communion? Dad was still bargaining. After all, that's only one more Sunday before the girls come. You've already agreed to the first Sunday in August. I'll try. Not that Dad wouldn't make sure that he was awake. But the old man hadn't used any of the support he was already giving him as a bargaining chip. He should get something. The truth was that Adrian cared more for the independence of refusing than he disliked the services. And Marlene would probably be there. Dad lent him a biography of Lee, and he took it out into the backyard to get some sun. But instead of reading about Lee's life, his thoughts wandered to his own. After some disappointments during his freshman year of high school, he had mostly asked out girls who didn't already have plans. Especially once he got his driver's license, he felt like he was a better option. Over time, his relationships had slowly grown more comfortable and familiar. He had learned a little from how girls talked among themselves, at least, as honestly as he could tell. There were certain boundaries that most respected, and no one expected Adrian Turner to cross them. Being his date wasn't always ideal, but it was better than being ignored. Marlene was different. He wasn't her only option, not even her only date. While he didn't usually worry about girls turning him down, he feared losing Marlene's interest. Their relationship didn't follow the usual high school script. They connected in ways that went beyond the typical dates and social expectations. He wanted more from her, but more than anything, he wanted to hold on to what they had. Maybe he'd take things slowly on their upcoming date. He turned away so the house wouldn't see how distracted he was and tried to focus on Lee's story instead. His day off that week was Friday, and he had a date with Marlene on Thursday night. He thought having the date the night before his day off was better. It meant he could stay up as late as he wanted. At breakfast, Dad gave him a stern look. "You forgot to shave," he said. "I have a date tonight. I'll shave for that. You've got a meeting with the public today. You'll shave for that." Dear listeners, next part will be released soon. Please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.